I welcome you to today's last session of the third week of the Hivemind, and definitely not the last in total. As you can see, I placed myself quite fittingly in front of our own little new biosphere that we created, inhabited currently by a few frogs. And if still alive, then a few crickets, which is spawning many interesting moral debates in our house. I can tell you that. But for now, I really want to welcome all of you. I'm totally thrilled that we have such a fantastic panel. I'm going to start kind of like just by very briefly telling you why I'm personally excited about having them on it. And I really encourage you to read their bios on the website. I am super thrilled to have Tom Chi here, one of the co-founders of Google X, but now really is pivoting full speed on climate destabilization, a term that he is really one of the people that have coined it. Before that, we actually, for a project that we've done on existential hope, trying to create kind of like positive, a positive onboarding document for the next generation. We actually had the pleasure of interviewing Tom Chi and David Brown, who were both on this call. And Tom was really pushing the point home, no, climate change is not the right term. We have to call it climate destabilization. I'm curious for what other people think. But I'm really, really happy to have you here. Tom also co-chaired one of our previous technical competitions on how can we use molecular precision to healing the planet. And I'm going to post the report of that in here with a few really interesting project proposals that came out of it. One of them was picked up by Patrick Mellor, a Foresight fellow, and who was using that workshop to kind of like galvanize one of his ideas that he'd been working on for a while, and is now pursuing that as a company with Maddie. I'm going to share a few infos on that as well, but it was definitely one of the really kind of like concrete, actionable projects that at least was significantly supported by the work that was done at the workshop. So I'm really happy that you're here, Tom. Welcome. I'm going to unmute you. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Okay. Next one up, we have. Let's see over here. We just randomly have next. Oh, Tia. Hello, Tia. Your background is fantastic, really quite fantastical. I think our backgrounds fit actually quite well together. I'm super happy that Tia is joining. Tia was only introduced me, I think now a little bit over 3 weeks ago. I'm super happy. I remember like your appearance in our introduction session where we got all speakers together, and I definitely won't forget your presence there. I think you like have a really, I think, just incredible way of energizing people. I think your project at Replenish Earth is really just quite inspiring, and I'm super happy because you're actually here in a way where you are enticing everyone, not just certain companies or certain people that are already working in the field, to kind of like take a stab at helping with restoring our ecosystem and with hopefully replenishing it too. So I'm really happy to have you here and to talk really concrete solutions. You're building really quite amazing communities and platforms for even individuals to track their progress in solving this problem. So welcome, Tia. I'll unmute you too.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Very excited to be joining today.
Hi. Awesome. Amazing. Okay. Next one up, who I'm seeing here is Will Marshall. Will, I'm going to meet you too. It's really good to have you. Look where I am right now. Let's see how the Wi-Fi connection, how stable it is. Too bad that we're not in the place at the moment. It's really such a pleasure to have you on here today. I think you're not only the co-founder and CEO of Planet Labs, which I think many people here on this call know and really hold dear, and which has done really a fantastic job even in COVID-19, of kind of like tracking the changes that are going on around our planet. But recently we discussed on a more personal way, like a few points that you were kind of like that you were really interested in pushing for now, in the sense that, hey guys, we've already done a few really freaking crazy behavior changes due to COVID-19. Can we use this as an impetus to keep going and to do more, because the really impending risk that most of us will be facing, even though if it's not as pregnant as as poignant as COVID-19, really it will be climate. So I'm super excited for you to have like a few concrete action items that you can share with participants, and I'm hoping that Tia's tools could be somehow maybe even used to track progress there. I'm super happy about that conversation going forward. So welcome, Will. Okay, hi.
I look forward to telling, yeah.
Awesome, great. Okay, and then next one up. Okay, now I just have to find him. Let me get David in here. David Grossup, if you're here, please raise your hand. Oh, David Brown. Oh my God, I was just looking at David Grossup. Hey, David, I didn't recognize you with the beard. Oh my God.
It's 2 months of growth, It's my own version of agriculture.
Oh man, you have to tell us all about the grooming and blooming of that agriculture, whether it's regenerative or automated already. For now, I'm super happy to have you here. You were also one of the folks that we had the pleasure of interviewing for the Existential Hope article. I'm hoping that maybe I can share a first draft of this in the chat. I reached out to the other participants there, and you've really done fantastic work at Upper E as a fellow there. And you are now really have like moved on into like quite the actional space with Pivot Bio, and I'm hoping that you can share some active work that you guys are doing on trying to use the current the current spotlight that really is laid on resiliency, on global resiliency, to kind of like push for the the impending catastrophe that is much harder to spot than COVID-19, but that will eventually and really not in the too distant future affect us all. So really happy to have you here. Welcome. Okay, well, I think we can jump right into it. I'm going to unmute all participants. No, I won't do that. I'm going to unmute all speakers for now. So feel free to chime in really kind of like quite fluidly whenever you think that you can add something to the discussion, what someone's saying. I encourage everyone to track the questions. They're all uploaded on Slack. You're welcome to upload questions there with a clap. But also feel free to collect questions here in the chat if Slack is too much of a movement for you right now. Okay, so we're going to dive right into it with, I think, the first question to kind of like set the scene a little bit. If you could just say maybe in a minute or so, like what specifically were you working on pre-COVID-19, and how has that work really pivoted due to COVID-19? Like what kind of like, how has the focus of your work shifted, if at all, or what do you think are new narratives that are available now that weren't before? And we're going to start with Tom. I'll unmute you.
Okay, yeah. So my work right before kind of the global lockdown, I had just launched this venture fund called At One Ventures to go invest to help humanity become a net positive to nature. So the central focus of what I'm doing didn't change at all. If anything, it became way more important because a lot of the things that we work on, like reducing emissions, changing animal agriculture, restoring soils, like all the different things are just more important than they were before. So that's good. And then I guess on the good side for us is all the deals became less expensive because all the investors got spooked broadly. So everything is actually a little bit better for the work that I'm doing, because there's like this moment where people recognize that a lot of change needs to happen. And that's kind of the business that I'm in.
Wow, okay, that's interesting. Like maybe you can already say something about that, because yesterday in the salon we talked about the fact that actually, in fact, even though people have more attention now on climate and resiliency, the fact that there may be less investment generally for for renewable energy and for similar technologies may actually be a major risk that could be arising here.
Well, actually, I was going to share an article to the opposite, which is renewable energy is set to generate more than coal in the US for the first time this year. So that's what we're currently on track for. It's already generated, renewable energy has generated more than coal for 90 of the first 130 days of the year. So we are ahead of schedule there. Now, look, if you're going to make money at the thing, the investors will come. The thing I was saying about pricing is if some investors are spooked generally, then all of the deals are less expensive. So for everybody that is actively investing, the world is much better.
Okay, yeah, that's good enough. I would love to hear from other panelists as well on that. I'm sure that you have better insights than I do here. Okay, great. Next one up, Tia, how is your work focus shifted? What kind of like narratives are available now that weren't before? Is there any immediate shift? I'm going to unmute you now.
Okay, can you hear me? Brilliant. For the first time in my life, I can experience that there is a commonality between something that is felt locally and globally in a way that goes beyond globalization. I think the biggest challenge that someone like myself working in sustainability has had for over 15 to 20 years is, what does this mean and why should I care? Because that is the biggest question, the shift of the perspective from the I to the we, where it's not only about myself and how I'm experiencing COVID, but how everybody across the world has the same narrative. And that narrative shift from the I to the we together is one of the most incredible experiences of this time today. So for myself at Replenish Earth, we've been replenishing Earth from home. A number of the challenges that we've had previously actually feel as if they're not there anymore. We've been thinking about many of these issues, these sort of commonalities that we see already with, sustainability and the impact that climate change has on businesses and individuals, as a kind of like an almost direct comparison point with the impact that people are experiencing today. So across the world, a number of people, I'm talking like 1.8 billion people, let's say about 20% of the world's population, lack adequate housing. And these figures, for the architectural work that we do, these figures, we're looking at maybe around 1 billion people living in informal settlements. Housing is such a fundamental human right, and without it, it's absolutely impossible to carry out any kind of social distancing, good hygiene, and prevent the spread of the disease, right? And not just that, it's a mental health. So in the home, lack of any access to the outside spaces can have a detrimental impact on people's mental and physical health. So for me, I think it's just the best time to be reaching out to people with so many different projects that we've had on the go, but they just feel that much easier because people are ready to have that conversation because they're experiencing it themselves. And this is not, we're having an experience and, oh, that's somebody else's issue over there. This is, the moment I feel that creativity goes beyond the crisis. Who are the winners of the crisis? And it's really interesting because at the moment, I strongly sense that, if I were to call on the fantastic words of Winston Churchill, never waste a good crisis. And I think this is, important for all of us to keep at the center of our discussion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really nice, I think, perspective, or like a really good intro in talking about opportunities and risks in a little bit. David, what's up for you? How has your work changed, if at all?
Well, so as a brief background, Pivot Bio makes a microbial fertilizer that makes nitrogen in the soil, and it takes 99% less greenhouse gas to manufacture than traditional fertilizer. And so I'm working particularly to accelerate our products to market faster and faster. So day to day, it's just made our lives a little bit harder. I think like everyone who has a business that has a lot of operations and logistics, things get more complicated and more complicated discussions need to have. In terms of the longer term narratives, it really gives me a lot of optimism. One of the things about our product is that it reduces the variability of the nitrogen applied to the farmer. So suddenly this extra feature of it is more and more important when people are really worried about uncertainty, and farmers are almost always worried about uncertainty. We also have seeing the agriculture market go from more and more cost constrained because we're in kind of a price collapse due to COVID-19. So we see the narratives around agriculture kind of being more and more interested in this sort of resilient solution that we're providing to farmers.
Okay, so like a little bit more complicated short term, but potentially more impact on the long run. Okay,
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, Will, how about you? The unmute button. Eternal. Okay, now. Not quite. Oh my God, come on. Will, are you here in the... Oh yeah, great.
You can hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great. Sorry, yeah, I mean, so we, I'm really excited about the idea of accelerating transitions, and that's why I really like the topic of this discussion. We've obviously seen a big acceleration of folks moving from travel to Zoom type meetings, and the question is, how do we accelerate the sustainability transition? We have actually, in terms of our work focus, just to answer your specific question, actually in general, everything apart from our satellite manufacturing planet has stayed the same, and we're actually seeing an uptick in interest for satellite data exactly because people are starting to think about how do they use remote sensing assets because they can't send a person out to an ecologically sensitive site, or they can't send a person out to test, to check on some supply chain or infrastructure. And so in some senses, what we're seeing visibly is quite a change of behavior. We see from space when we look every day quite a lot of changes of behavior in terms of patterns of life, but I'm excited about how people are accelerating their transition to remote sensing because that enables us to reduce travel, which helps the environment. But I'm particularly interested to discuss today how we might look at changes of human behavior, and as you said at the beginning, look at the degree to which we have to change behavior to actually stop the environmental catastrophe of our age, and I actually believe that the change of behavior might be less for this than I have a hopeful hypothesis that I wanted to explain to people in a second.
Okay, sounds great. I think we should definitely, hop to the hopeful bits as soon as we can. But I do think that, at the beginning, maybe like front loading that with like risk that we may be experiencing if we don't get it right would be useful to do. So perhaps I think you can all now unmute yourselves because I just made you co-host, so it should be a little easier. And please feel free to do that and just chime in with each other, right? Like I'm just the back holder of this conversation. So perhaps. We can start with Tia, then go to Tom, Will, and David, but feel free to make it fluid about what do you think are the biggest risks arising right now from COVID-19, for kind of like for messing it up as an opportunity to actually get actions installed, to have like a more resilient planetary ecosystem, on the long run. Yeah,
completely. Alison, I think it is one of the most important existential crises that we've been through. It's the first time where we've come to this level of global, identification with the current issue without having an actual war. So can you imagine we've actually come to an opportunity to have this discussion, to work globally and create something that I often sort of reference called the human commons, right? So we've got the global commons, we've got the digital commons, but what about the human commons? What about all of the work that we individually do to actually bring together for the actual crisis and the development of our theories and what's most appropriate today? If we're missing out on these things and we're risking not actually, A, not being prepared, but B, not learning from this is a very interesting situation to be in. So, there is, of course, the existential side of it. There's a resilient side of it. And cities, whether it's climate change or COVID, many a time we're not prepared for what may happen. And so what kind of preparation or crisis management or conflict resolution do we need to have in place? A lot of the climate crises, like issues, you know, in places, say, like Syria, have actually come from famine, that have come from a lack of food, from climate-related issues. So these things become political very quickly. And if we're not careful, then we're risking a huge amount of introspection that then leads to suffering and trauma. And I think we need to meet the challenges of today with the fundamental shifts that we need to take on board to mitigate the risks for now by learning what it is that we may do better. So yes, if we are to ignore, right, that there isn't going to be a new normal, want to go back to the way that it was, back to business how it was, then it's almost as if we're pretending that this didn't happen, right? So we're denying that this isn't happening. So it's very important, I think, to take a moment to take stock of what we can do to take this forward, and not just think about the sort of first, second, and third order economic effects, but go much longer than that, because these sort of smaller cycles politically are ruining the longer term consequences that we're living.
Neat, thanks. Tom, would you like to go next?
I mean, what I heard in the intro was that nobody that is on the panel is having their work slow down. And if I could summarize that, it's when the world is real sick, then everybody gets interested in the folks whose work is to heal the world.
Mm.
And so it's like, yeah, no, there's more interest in the business that I'm doing than ever. And it's like, so that's on the good side. On the negative side, there are a bunch of things for how the world used to work. And those folks are waiting because their businesses are really hurt right now. And they're waiting to come back in and take back the territory that they're losing. And obviously the folks that are working on healing the world, we're starting from a smaller base. So there's a question of, from like the time and capital perspective and from the operations perspective, will we be able to make enough of, put enough stakes in the ground during this time period where there's more interest so that that stuff holds and can grow substantially, over the next 5-10 years.
Neat. Will?
Yeah, and Alison, maybe you can try and unmute my phone because it would be better for next time. But so generally, I see the risks are nationalism because it could go either way. We've got this oneness that you were referring to, Tia, but on the other hand, we've got the potential lockdown of travel that then could be exacerbated, people trying to build things and separate economies. That actually works against, I think, what we need to do is and unify. So I'm worried about nationalism. The second thing is partisanship. We're seeing this sort of split of in the US. It's really crazy, and it sort of interrelates with the third thing, which is this post-truth era. I mean, this is a real-time test for the competence of governments. But what's fascinating is that even though the statistics are in this morbid sense of how many people are dying, and it's quite clear which countries are doing well and not, truth doesn't seem to be playing a particularly good role in this, in the sense that there's whole spheres of people that just are denying reality, and they're not noticing this, and it's not getting through. And so, I think it's super important that we fight the post-truth era as we exit out of this. It's something we try to do with our satellite data, just shed light on what's going on around the world. It's a small piece and part to play, but I think we've all got to fight it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we had a strong session on sense making, I think 2 days ago, and we're going to have a follow-up, continued follow-up next week, because there was a considerable interest of both panelists and participants to bring it forward. And I think both in terms of how do you communicate narratives well, but also then how do you equip people on the other end, with the tools to actually make sense of whatever narrative that they're being given. So I definitely think that's one of the underlying things that we have to get right if we want to solve any of the remaining problems. Yep. Okay, David, how about you?
Well, I'd echo everything Will said, and I'd want to add two things. One, I think a risk is we're seeing right now communities around the world respond to this crisis, and how they respond is and will be different than our expectations of how they'd respond. So one risk is simply we don't take the time to listen to how they're really responding. and build our solutions on the basis of how a real world responding to a crisis responds, and try to apply those lessons to the climate crisis. The second risk is that, as Will says, the political opportunity is picked up by people who are opposed to solving large problems. One number that I thought was interesting is that the size of the stimulus, the $2 trillion stimulus that got passed, is larger, or as large, as most Green New Deal proposals. And you should expect, coming out of these crises, countries around the world to have a stimulus bill to kind of rebuild their economy. And we have an opportunity to make that a climate bill. And the biggest risk is we don't manage to grab that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Even there, yes.
Well, this just feeds so well into the next thing from my perspective about the optimistic side of this, and that's just the scale of human changes that are necessary to fix the challenges of climate. And by the way, I would much prefer we don't say climate, but rather say environment, because I think the real challenge of our age is the massive destruction of the environment. And if I can just mention what I think is our hypothesis, do you mind if I go on this thread, Alison? Sorry, I don't. Okay. You know, the challenge of our age, the global crisis of our age, is environmental degradation, and you know, we've seen massive destruction of wildlife around the planet. Just to give a few stats in case people are not aware of the degree to which we've lost 82% of wild mammals on the land, 75% of fish in lakes and rivers, 70% of insects, over half of the corals that were alive, and this is all in the last 40 years. Now, the question and the hypothesis on my mind is like, if that had happened in 4 months, like this just happened, or a couple of months, I think we'd be making much more dramatic changes. If we suddenly lost most of the wildlife, we'd be so heartbroken about it, and humans would change their behavior to do with the destruction of the environment. And by the way, that's why I make the distinction with climate change. Climate is actually only the second or third driver of this challenge. It's also just land use change. It's turning forests and prime forests into agricultural land and other challenges, not just the climate. Although climate is one of the most important factors. But it brings me to my hypothesis, which I think is the hopeful side of this, which is that the amount of change that we've just done for COVID, whether that's emergency packages like David was just saying in stimulus, or whether it's personal behavioral changes, like we've traveled less and I've isolated and done all these things, the degree and the question and the hypothesis that the behavioral change necessary to solve environmental degradation is less than what we've just done for COVID-19. Now, I don't know the answer that is surely in the positive here, so I don't know, but I'm just throwing out the hypothesis. It might be true that the amount of change we have to make to solve the environmental degradation catastrophe is less than what we just did. So, for example, and then the question would be, like, what would that world look like and how could we incentivize it? And the quick brush strokes on what that world might look like is, of course, less travel, but not as much less as we've just done for COVID, you know? It's less consumerism, but, you know, arguably less of a reduction than we've just done. It's some things that we haven't done. It's not exactly the same, but in degree, I think, and I might argue that the amount of change, yes, we need less big stimulus packages. But we need a few other changes. So if you just look at individual behavior, yes, we've got to travel less, let's be less consumerist. We've also got to change our diets to more plant-rich diets. You know, because in a sustainable world, we have to reduce meat consumption. We've got to do more work on preserving parks, and all of us going into nature during this time, I think is fantastic. But we could be protecting those parks. And then we can talk about how we would incentivize that. But I would argue on the first brush of it, and I'd love to write this up sometime. The first brush stroke suggests that the amount of change is less than what we just did. It's just that we haven't recognized the urgency because it's been happening over 40 years rather than over a couple of months. And had it been happening in a couple of months, we would equally be willing to make such a dramatic change. And I think it's amazing that we're flexing our emergency response muscles, and we just need to transition this energy instead of going back to our previous behavior and economic state. We need to transition to a new third place, not the pre-COVID economy and societal behavior, not the COVID economy and societal behavior, but a third future that is a sustainable one that we could jump to instead of jumping back. And that behavioral change the hopeful piece is that behavioral change might not be as big as what we just did.
All right, so I'm hearing from you that you'd be interested in actually like figuring out kind of like numerical values for like, okay, if we did another round of behavior changes in this regard, then if we all did that in a coordinated way, and maybe we can use Earth Day or whatever as a good point for coordination there, then we can cause X amount of change. And we've already done this with COVID-19, and this may even be less. This may even be less of a change, so let's keep going. So I'm hearing that this is almost like a very it may involve everyone, and so I'd be super curious about you, Tia, given the fact that you're working on like really metrics in which individuals can track the impact that they're having, and that you're really trying to include everyone. What you think of an idea like that, and if you have any thoughts on it.
Thanks for that, Will. Thanks for sort of outlining so many of the different factors that we've all been affected by. And I think that, if we are to piggyback this issue, right, of the pandemic, we've got a number of different aspects that can actually really help us. One of them is this moment calls for an action plan. And of course, we can ignore it or give it aside or give some power to the politicians and anybody else who wants to do that on our behalf. But that power is ours. And what we do with that power and how we interact with that choice that we have is about creating the system that we want to birth. And I think that for such a long time, we've been fighting down here, right? That we missed out that this is the sort of aim. So it's about sort of stepping away, taking a moment, saying, thank you very much. We needed that, got us to the place that we're at right now. Without the capabilities of capitalism, perhaps we wouldn't have got to the place that we are today. So thank you very, very much for doing so. Of course, capitalism is capital accumulation, and much of that capital is accumulated on landfill sites, which have only recently become more and more, aware of. But in terms of the actual negative impacts of that, aside from where the city's infrastructure could take all of our behavior and put it into services, it's the first time that it's gone beyond the city walls, right? Where it seeps into the environment, seeps into, within, let's say, 100, 150 years, like Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, where it was the identification for the very first time that one day silence is going to hit spring and you're not going to know what the hell hit you because of all of those chemicals that you're producing for the weed killers that are actually just the biodiversity of the planet coming up and showing you cannot have a monocrop, right? This is not natural, and nature has its own version of creating the sort of the biodiversity even in the soil. So it's in the soil. And so what we're doing is from soil up, creating systems, ecosystems, right, that do not identify with this biodiversity. And I think what we're realizing today is what are the step changes that we need to see. Some of those can actually be piggybacked with such a fast, impact like this pandemic. Within 3.5 months, people in India and Delhi are seeing the cleanest water that they've ever seen in the river Ganga, as well as the Himalayas from Delhi itself. This is an experience that people have never had, right? Because they've never seen that. And this is the immersion, I think, that's so important for us to take the learnings and what I want to say is sort of the emotional charge out of it, right, of this experience. Of course, my father was in hospital, and so that became very personal very quickly. But beyond that, like taking the emotional charge out and taking the learnings and applying these learnings is more appropriate for where we are today. So what are the step changes that we can make? How can people bring in their choices to empower themselves and take an action that is related with what we want to bring into the world? You know, of course we can discuss like bigger visions and everything, but you know, I'd love to know like concrete actions, like what do we want to do by when?
Yeah, so if I could weigh in, I think what this last, 60, 80 days have shown us is how fragile the things that we thought were giants were. Like we basically brought global oil to its knees in 30 days. And, coal had been 40% of US energy generation. It's going to be less than, 10% within a couple years, given this trajectory. It's like we can turn this stuff over pretty quickly when we actually decide to turn it over. We just did. We saved gigatons out of the atmosphere just by changing how we're transporting ourselves right now. And I think a number of those changes in terms of a larger percentage of people not wanting to commute and working from home are going to stick. Some of them are going to snap back. It's fine. But outside of energy generation, transportation, which are huge sectors that we have a direct impact on, which we've shown, in the last, 60 days, food is enormous, right? So most of the habitat loss is because of agriculture. As a sector, there's as much emissions from agriculture as there is in all of energy generation. So all the people campaigning for solar and wind, what you eat is as impactful as that, if not more. And especially when you look at the potential for carbon sequestration from healthy soils, it may be even significantly more impactful. So another choice that we can make, which entirely belongs from us, because I don't think we should be telling folks, hey, generally speaking, we got to lobby governments to do better. I think that's uninteresting, and it means that you only get to go do anything of import once every couple of years when you vote. The truth is in 60 days we can end industries that have had a hegemony for decades, and that came from a consumer level change. So we have always had that power. We're just not aware of how powerful we are on this front. And that the same thing can happen with food, that happened with transportation, can happen with energy. I have a bunch of links that I can send at the end for things that you could do within one day that would change your footprint quite dramatically.
Lovely, thank you. David?
Yeah, I had two thoughts. One was that looking at how people are responding to the crisis, I don't really see a global response. I see it more as a multinational or multi-communal response. That people are really concerned with what is going on in their family, in their community, and individual leaders are stepping forward and saying this is a crisis. And I've seen leaders who I disagree vastly politically, people even on the alt-right, who have tried to rally their communities because they're worried. And I think capturing that will be a key problem going forward. I think, in terms of agricultural change, I'm probably one of, I work on it in a fairly incremental way, right? I'm focusing on this one small issue of microbial production of nitrogen, right? And making one change at a time. I think there are two things, and I think those changes are the critical changes we need on the time frame we need to deal with global warming. When we talk about changes in people's behavior in terms of consumption of food, I think of that as a generational shift, right? Food is highly cultural. When I go to my colleagues in the Midwest and they serve me steaks that are from the farm that their father raised those steaks, it's there, and that's a cultural tradition that they will be very loath to give up on. And the other aspect is that agriculture, running a farm, is super complicated, even though it's monocropped, even though the tractors are automated. All the farmers I work with are dealing with as much complexity as they can handle. And so in order to implement those changes, you have to make what is an enormous amount of complexity simple. Because when they hear do this, this, and this, and you'll do better, they have 100 things they do during the field season that have to change, and they need to feel confident that if they change those, not only would they would see a better outcome than if they didn't. So that is kind of what draws the conservatism, draws their conservatism to change.
Yeah, I remember when we interviewed you, you were like, we should use the word heritage more, because heritage is something that folks can get on board on either side of the political spectrum, and it's actually something that is like deeply conservative. It's like conservation, really. Yeah.
And from a soil perspective, an Iowa farmer does not want their land to erode. An Iowa farmer doesn't want Iowan farmers to not exist in 50 years because all of Iowa eroded away. They have a lot of interest.
Yeah, I would love to kind of like, I think, the threads that Will and Tom are pulling at, and you just chimed in, I would love to kind of like, can we make this concrete in the sense of like, what are kind of like concrete behavior changes? Like if after this, for example, I wrote action items down, I'm like, okay, what can I give people first as a hope of like, how have they already changed their actions in ways that have significantly, impacted change, like on an individual level, like what have they already affected? And then what are like potential ways in which they could go further? Can you like pull on a few threads there?
I could give you one off the bat, which is that if we talk about sustainability to farmers, what they hear is a food company is going to ask me to do something more complicated and pay me the same amount of money for doing it. Just as you imagine, not that exciting to them. If we can actually get money for changing practices and for sustainability directly from the consumers to the farmers, we'll move them much faster towards the practices that we want to see in our food system.
Yeah, I read something pretty similar because I pasted in a block of actions that you can do. I'll just paste it again. But like eating better, so higher quality produce that is produced in the way that you want, higher quality meat that's produced in the way that you want. And oh, that gets too expensive. Well, the other thing that we can do that would have a big impact is because of COVID, we're all buying less stuff. And there's some things that you really, really miss and you wish you could buy. And there's other things where you're like, I don't miss it. I don't even know why I was buying that so much. And I think for the ones where you don't miss it, just stop. Because you're going to save that money, you can spend it on better food, and then you'll be doing two things at once, reducing the manufacturing footprint for a bunch of garbage and increasing the amount of available capital for people that are doing agriculture the way that you want. All of you are muted.
I might add just a couple of points to your list there, Tom. I mean, I certainly agree with those points, and eat better. I mean, we have to tackle the meat consumption, but I do think that to your point, David, it would normally consider and be a long shift, but we've seen big shifts happening in people's behavior in short intervals when they see it. We've made a huge societal transition in just a few short years towards accept people of different genders and different sexual preferences, and that's been a tremendous change. We've seen a big change in behavior just in the last few months in travel. In the meat world, we've seen, of course, a huge transition to meatless or meat substitute products, and the fact that took off so quickly into the chains of the various fast food companies is kind of astonishing, and so maybe it's not so ridiculous, especially if you combine it with less meat and not just get rid of meat. And that it is a double whammy. I mean, I think animals and ruminants are part of a sustainable ag future, but the degree of meat consumption cannot be. But just to add to Tom's list, what I would also add is voting for pro-environment politicians, because that's one of the things that we can all do that's really, of course, substantive. And then helping parks and preserves. This is all from an individual standpoint. We can talk about what governments and society need to do. But I think individuals can help with parks. People were wanting to get outside more anyway. And parks need our help to protect and preserve. We need to increase the amount of parks and preserve land, both marine parks and land ones. And the estimates are that we need at least 30% of our land and oceans turned into no-take-out situations to preserve the biosphere, and we can do that. I mean, the California story and the U.S. National Park story is a tremendous one. Let's continue with that for us. And I think individuals can help a lot with that in terms of volunteerism.
Lovely. Okay, I just had a really interesting question here pop up in the chat, and I think that I would love to hear from all of you, to give some perspective. I think we actually have nailed like a few very concrete things, that people could do, like kind of like a wish list, really, as it was called in the chat. What do you think is the kind of like the larger theory of change, behind that? Like, how do you think, and of course, this is more like an elevator pitch and requires more time than just a panel. But like, what do you think if we actually want to? If we actually want to stop what's impeding, what are the kind of like big levers of change that we should be looking at, even for individuals, but also for companies or even for politicians? And perhaps
for a really long time we've seen sustainability as an afterthought. CSR departments, oh, we've made our money, created our profits, now let's put something towards a community, right? This sort of capitalistic model of putting money towards a charity. I think for the first time we're actually shifting that model to forethought. So how do we design products and services that do not have waste in them? Where do we create systems that don't need to leave a black bag of rubbish outside for somebody else to take responsibility of, because it's my responsibility of where it is that I'm purchasing things, to where it is that I'm interacting. All of my interactions have an impact somewhere and somehow. So that's one. I also think that critical thinking, for God's sake, how many times do we come across a situation where we just don't think through an entire structure of something? We're short-sighted to the extent of detriment, to the extent where we're not considering the externalities, because externalities are accepted in economics today. If you want it to be completely shifting, right, if you want that change, then perhaps we need to be considering the externalities and the issues of economics completely upside down, where we're not using measures like GDP as a measure of success, but recognizing that we need to go beyond GDP and not just a measure of, what you're spending, your expenditures, because it doesn't really matter if you're a medical professional coming to the stage of, making a decision on whether you spend, this hospital, like a triage system, for example, that you're going to be saving this life or that life. If you've been spending so much on, let's say, cigarettes, and I've got like an issue with my lungs, and, perhaps somebody else that's healthier than me comes in, but with the same age, there is going to be a decision that's made on my behalf. And often that's related to the decisions that I've made previous to this. And what's really interesting is that you can't just tell people to be healthy, right? Because that's what they're doing at the moment. That in their mind is what they're told to do, right? What they're told to do is to maintain a medical history. It's kind of like a credit card, a credit history. You won't get a mortgage, which I call a grip of death, because that's what mort and gauge means, right? You're not going to maintain any kind of credit worthiness in a system when the system exacts you that kind of grip, that hamster wheel. You're not going to be able to be healthy and nutritionally understanding of the situation of your immunity if all you're told to do is have 5 fruits and vegetables, 8 glasses of water, and a recommended daily allowance of vitamin D that is like pitiful, right? Doctors are not taught about nutritional health. So you have to take it upon your own hands to educate yourself about these things. So where's the prophylactic, right? Where's the preventative health? Where are the preventative measures not to get us into these kind of crises in the first place?
Right, thanks. And who would like to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty close to a point where we can affect a major transition. Like the last link I pasted in there, you can convert whatever your mix is right now to 50% renewables that you're using for your household in about 5 minutes. And if a large number of people do that, it absolutely speeds up the adoption of renewables, no question. So a bunch of intermediaries like Common Energy, they're coming up. They're providing these sort of networks of access to renewable energy sourcing so that you can do it for your home. Even if you live in an apartment and you can't put solar panels on your roof, that changes your footprint a huge amount. And basically, we are in a spot that if we are smart right now, we can put the petrochemical business into a corner that it cannot get out of. Like, look at how quickly it collapsed when we stopped using transportation fuels. 70% of oil is for transportation fuels. And even staying at their production level collapsed the price of oil to the point that it was negative on the futures market. Right? That is basically straight up losing money for doing work. You stop doing that real fast when that's the situation. And that was always within a month of our control. Now, we didn't do that before, and now we've shown that that's exactly what happens in the market when you do it. These consumable-based businesses, they are fragile all the time. Whenever the actual demand curve changes for them, they are in major trouble. And they're capital intensive and fragile at the same time. That's the worst possible case because they can't transition to a different thing. So like, we should corner them and we should not buy more plastics because a bunch of them are pivoting into large scale plastic production because per the tonnage of the same raw material feedstock, they make more dollars per tonnage. So there's going to be a huge push for them to produce a huge amount of plastics, and we got to just say no. Like, if you do that, you give them no space to go, and they're done. And the world after, petrochemical industry dominating governments through lobbying and denying climate is a very different world than the one that we've been living in for the last 40 years. So we have it in a corner. We should do the kill shot. Like,
all right.
Yes, keep going.
I think that's a nice beam. David, what do you have to say to that rally?
Yeah, well, I think I agree in broad stroke, but we should remember that there's entire cities and communities for whom this is who are dependent upon this, and we have to have compassion and helping in that there's people impact of industries collapsing. We've seen this in Detroit, and you could see it in Houston as well. And if you're a person in Houston, that's going to scare you. It's going to scare you a lot. I think in general, one fascinating fact is that COVID-19 roughly doubles the average person's chance of death in a year because it's 10x as deadly as the flu. And so when we have something that's 10x more deadly than normal or more impactful than normal, we see suddenly 80% of a country actually believing in shelter in place and actually trusting scientists. So the question answer that I have going forward is, how do we make dealing with climate change feel to people less like a luxury political decision and more like a necessary decision for themselves personally and politically? And if they really feel that it is important for protecting their children, average American spends 15% of their income per year on their children. They'll be willing to do things to protect future generations, but I think there's sometimes a disconnect where they think that dealing with making the solution will either hurt them individually more, like if they live in Houston and are part of the oil industry, directly or indirectly, or that it isn't a big deal, right? And if we can help convince them that the world is going to be 10x worse in ways that matter for their children, I think they'll respond.
All right, thank you. Will.
I'm just trying to unmute myself. Yeah, look, I think that's all good. I think your sensitivities that you were just put in there, David, to transitions are absolutely right. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, but we should have compassion as we do, whether that's in oil or in the changes to agriculture. But I say we pick up the mantle and try and go to this new future. I think that the kind of thing that I think would be most useful for that is a very clear list of defined things that we each have to do as individuals, like 3 or 5 things, and that we each have to do as countries, like 3 or 5 things. And I think amazingly, most of the things to achieve the sustainable future that we want, most can be done with that. I mean, we have to travel less. We've just done that already. We don't have to social distance anymore, but we do have to do another slight change, which is changing of our diets. We have to do a few other things. We could make a concise list of that and promulgate that, especially via social media influencers. I think that would be a sensible thing to do. And then the governments have to take on their role of the incentives, stopping, accelerating the transition from coal to renewables, and of course establishing the parks and the marine parks and things like that. And so I think there's a short list on both the, if you like, societal level and the industrial level and the individual level that has to be done. I think we could identify it, write it down, and then before we come out of this, we'll sort of promulgate a social pact that we move not back to the pre-COVID society, nor stick in the COVID one, but jump to a third and more hopeful and sustainable future.
Thank you. I think that's a really nice way. I'm mindful of the time here. We have maybe 2 minutes left, but I think that's a very nice segue into final words. If there's only one thing that participants do after this call, what would you recommend them following up with? Do you want to go first, Tom?
I guess it sounds cruel to go kill an industry, but trust me, that industry existing is also cruel. And what we've done in terms of military presence and ramp up and geopolitical destabilization for the purpose of oil, that's way more cruel than putting some chemical engineers out of business. And there's lots of useful things they could be using their skills on other than petrochemical industry.
Thank you. Tia, final words.
Learn the rules and change the game.
Okay, and David, what would you like participants to do right after this, if it's one thing?
Yeah, I would say engage compassionately with the people who disagree with you while not, while still keeping firm to your principles.
All right, and Will, what would you like to, what would you like participants to take away from here?
Hashtag don't go back.
Nice.
All right. Well, let's see. I mean, I would actually be interested, I think what Tia mentioned at the beginning as well about, different, like you can already see how different behavior changes affect the environment, right? You were calling out that river, that is now, for the first time kind of like clean-ish, right? And I think like satellite data can provide a similar image. So actually like making a little mosaic of like ways in which it's better now than it used to be. And then, enticing people like, hey, you did this just now. Here are the stats that you changed. Let's not squander this opportunity. Here's like a potential laundry list. Let's use Earth Day or whatnot to at least kind of like get people to have a little bit more agency in kind of like the futures that they could create. Because I think it is actually quite empowering to see that, with a few behavioral changes, you can have a big effect. Okay, well, maybe we can rally the troops and get something like that together. And yeah, I want to thank all of you. It's now exactly noon. Thank you so much for coming on. I think we've covered a lot. From definitions to like risk, if we wanted this opportunity, to specific things individuals could be doing, states could be doing, to the risk involved in communicating this correctly, and first and foremost of also thinking about the people that are negatively affected by the changes that we're proposing, and picking them up in a way where it's easy for them to agree and to actually and to shift their minds to. I think there was a really nice point of view, David, as well, and definitely not to be forgotten. Thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye from the official panel for now. Bye bye, everyone.